Old Lewes pubs, and quite a few talks have been done on old Lewes pubs. But as a social historian, I'm really interested in more than just the pubs. And for instance, here we've got the wonderful old building, which was the White Lion. No longer there, it was demolished in 1939, it's just a car park there. Another example that you'll see on these Lewes pub talks in the books is the Sussex Arms. But say, being a social historian, I'm far more interested, not in the buildings, but in the people that were in these buildings. And here, for instance, every time I look at this photograph, I think that woman there must be standing on the step behind him. But she's not. She's not incredibly tall. This man here is Billy Hathaway. He's very short. You can tell he's short because his trousers take up about 2/3 of his body. But he was a jockey, and he gave up jockeying and retired and decided to pull pints for a living, and that was the first of one of many of his pubs. Here from sort of the other side of the scale is, we think that's Eli Dore, who he was, this is the Morning Star, again, it's not there, it's shut down in the 1920s, but he was the final landlord. Massive chap with the most amazingly huge feet. And I know he's not on this set, but he sort of towers over these people here. So this is what I'm interested about. It's the landlords, the landladies, the punters, the regulars, the things they drank in the pubs, and of course the consequences of all this drinking in the pubs. Now Lewes itself was very well known for having 7 churches, 7 breweries and 70 pubs. You consider the size of the town. It's the county town, but it's not that big, you know. It actually had 65 at its peak, and that peak was the Edwardian period, and there was a lot of drunkenness there. Now, there's plenty of drunkenness before the Edwardian period, and I'll give you a couple of examples. This is the Lewes Arms, still there, because I took that the other day. Hope it's still there anyway. And in 1813, there was a chap called George Wyatt who was drinking in there. Nothing wrong with that, except it was a Sunday morning. So drunkenness or drinking in pubs quite happily tolerated, but not on a Sunday. You should be in church. So every Sunday you'd get a high constable, and in 1813 that was John Holman, and he'd go from pub to pub just to make sure no one's drinking on a Sunday. So any pub worth their salt would get a little boy act as a lookout, and high constables come in, and everyone would hide behind the bar. Quite often they were discovered hiding behind the bar by the high constable. But Lewes Arms always seemed to get caught, and George Wyatt was sitting bold as brass behind the window there, sitting at the bar with a pint. So they went in to get him, brought him out, and they realised they didn't have a key for the lockup. So the high constable's assistant went to get the key, and so George and he were there, and there was a struggle, and George fell over and smacked his head on the pavement, and they had to call for the doctor. And this is the clipping from the newspaper in 1813. Sent for Dr. Moore, who examined the wound and prescribed for him. He was taken into the Lewes Arms house, where we left him there, and pursued our regular perambulations after giving Norman, the landlord, a severe reprimand. So the only difference for poor George is that he's now sitting probably back where he was with his pint, except with a large head wound. Don't drink on the Sunday. Dangerous. I'm going to be putting quite a few newspaper clippings up. I know the temptation is just to read it, but don't. I'll pick out the amusing bits or the interesting bits. This is another one. This is Anne Ansell, better known as the Dark Angel, and she was in the White Lion. So we saw that picture, that beautiful old pub. But to me, what's far more fascinating, there's a woman in there that everyone knows as the Dark Angel, and she's behaving in an indecent manner. That's far more interesting history than looking at the building to me. She actually got sentenced to a month's hard labour. But I love the fact that there was a woman wandering around the town who everyone knew as that. And again, don't read it. It's sort of partly there to show that I'm not making it up, and secondly, so you've got something else to look at rather than me. But this is Margaret Kenny, now 1878, and she was at the Britannia Inn. Britannia Inn was in Keir Street, the building's still there, and it doubled up as a boarding house. You wouldn't believe it from looking on the outside, but you could get up to 25 or 30 people staying there in one night. She was one of them, a few too many drinks at the bar, and she wouldn't go to bed. The landlady, Susanna Pelham, was trying to go to bed. She was annoying all the other clientele, and in the end they had to call the police. And they took her to the police station, and it was at that point she decided to remove all her clothes and refused to put them back on. She ended up the next day in front of the judge in just a rug that they'd managed to find and put round her. And as you can see at the bottom, she was taken to jail in a wagonette with the rug thrown over her. So all that time in prison, just refused to put her clothes on. Now, I'm going to take you into the Edwardian period now, because it all kicked off in the Edwardian period. And what I did, I went through the court reports for Lewes, because they were put in the newspapers, they were printed in the newspapers in the Sussex Express every week. So it's not what the newspapers decided was a worthy story. These are just from the court reports that were sent in automatically. This is just from 1 week. This is in 1904. And you can see 3 examples. We've got William James Walters, and he was staggering all over the road. He was fined. Arthur Piper here of Keir Street. He was also staggering about the road and was assisted home by a friend. And John Geever here, and he again is just lying in a helpless state on the pavement. This is the sort of thing you're up against if you're a policeman in Lewes. Here's another classic, 1904 again. Seems a bad year for drink, or a good year for drinking. I don't know, it depends on your viewpoint, really. Sidney Page, who was so drunk, he was trying to sing a song. So that drunk, he couldn't actually get a song out. But it wasn't just men. There were plenty of women getting drunk as well. And we saw the Victorian stuff, that there was women as well as men causing problems. This is, again, just 1 week in 1904. And we've got a bad start at the top there. Winnie Gates, age 15. And you can see the girls are fighting in Westgate. And her dad eventually picked her up and dragged her in. She probably wasn't very popular. But don't worry about Winnie, because she eventually did settle down. She got married, and she lived in Lewes, and she lived until the 1970s. Extraordinary conduct. The next one, Ellen Brown, a stranger, had come into Lewes, and she was basically going around Lewes High Street kicking men. That's what she decided to do with her Saturday afternoon. And at the bottom we've got Maud Bennett of Brighton, who was just wandering about South Street and falling into the riverbank. And an absolute classic here, Ellen Finn here, of No Fixed Abode. She was drunk, dancing and shouting and causing a crowd to assemble. Now, you'll notice actually quite a difference, and I promise you I haven't gone carefully through and tried to sort of pick out ones that fit the argument. These are just general things that happened. Men generally, when they were drunk, were literally sort of drunk and incapable, rolling around the pavement, unable to speak or get themselves home, where women were doing something that would cause, as you can see, a crowd to assemble. It was women who were fighting. It was women who were screaming. It was women who were shouting and being offensive, more often than not exclusively, but more often than not. Now, this is very well demonstrated by a case in 1904, strangely enough, and P.C. Edwards was called to Southover because he'd had a report that there were some women fighting there. And so what did he do? He went over to Southover, and he looked for the crowd of people, because that's what you do. And he squeezed himself through the crowd, and there he saw a woman standing over another woman, about to kick her. And the woman on the ground was called Fanny Farley, and the woman about to kick her was also Fanny Farley. They were mother and daughter. And you can see they were both fined. But absolutely classic example here. And he tried to rouse her. This is the policeman trying to rouse the girl on the ground without effect. And with the assistance of Sergeant Upton and 3 bystanders, he carried her home. So it took 5 men to carry this girl home. She must have been pretty hefty. And while he was doing that, Fanny Farley Senior interfered and used filthy language. Now this, believe it or not, this happened on Christmas Eve of 1904. Of course, no television in those days, so they didn't have an EastEnders Christmas special, so they had to make up their own harrowing Christmases for entertainment. And quite often, in these crowds, there'd be men, women and children. Children would go along, you know, so sort of, Mum, I'm bored. Well, go and watch the Farleys having a fight. It's Christmas. Now, of course, it wasn't just women who were being violent. There, of course, were incidents of men being aggressive. Here's a classic. So William Pearce, who was a labourer, and you can see here that the policeman, P.C. Upton, in this case, had gone over, and the defendant then got up, he was asked to be quiet, but he got up, stripped to his shirt, rolled his sleeves up, and challenged to fight anyone in the street. Witness asked him again to be quiet, but he refused, was very abusive, and put fists in witness's face. Eventually, defendant's mother fetched him inside, and he said he was not drunk and that the policeman was a storyteller. So this again is another perfect example. What men were doing so often, there are so many reports of men rolling their sleeves up, taking their jackets on, saying, right, who wants to fight, and never actually fighting. The women actually just went in for the scrap, and the men just threatened it, and when it came to it, either their mum fetched them home or they bottled it, you know. But you can see here, he said he wasn't drunk. Again, that was a common excuse. Of course, now, we can have half a pint, we can smell alcohol on our breath, but, you know, if we need to be breathalyzed, you can say, oh, he's not drunk, he's only had half a pint. No such luxury for the police in those days. So there were all sorts of excuses. And here's a few. Not drunk, but excited. This was used by men and women quite a lot. They claimed their sort of hyperactivity just was pure excitement. So, you know, you might be running around shouting and kicking men in Lewes High Street, but it's just through excitement, not through drunkenness. Prisoner pleaded that some soldiers had given her 3 glasses. She was not drunk, only weak. Being weak was generally just used by women. They always seemed to be weak at around 11:30 at night, about 30 feet from a pub. That was when weakness overtook them suddenly. But there were a lot of soldiers billeted around, and you know, soldiers probably would persuade women to come for a drink with them and then just get them drunk and then leave them, which often happened. Many reports of that. And this is a good one. A prisoner pleaded he could not stand much drink as he once had sunstroke. So if you do, I hope no one does, but if you do get arrested for being drunk and disorderly, try that excuse. It might work. This is, or was, I should say, the Lewes workhouse. And in 1902, they removed all the inmates, sent them to the Chay workhouse up the road, and this became the reformatory for inebriated women. And there were 14 of these put around the country, and they were there simply to reform drunken women. It was an alternative to prison, and they were to be reformed through work, exercise, routine, religion and diet. Trouble is, it didn't really work. There were amazing amounts of escape attempts, so every couple of months it would just be another headline, inebriates have escaped. You'll see here, it's very difficult to get actual photographs inside here, and they've got specific uniforms on, so they're easily spotted. So if anyone escaped, really all the police need to do was just knock on the door or just pop into the local pubs and take them out and put them back in the reformatory. But some are a bit more daring, and there's a case here, inebriates escape. And 2 of the women, Marie Delvincourt and an accomplice, they decided during exercise time to leapfrog the wall and run to the hills. So ironically, they actually did more exercise than the women who decided not to escape that day. And as you can see, they made off towards the downs, and there was an exciting chase. Somewhere it says there was an exciting chase anyway. And yes, they were captured near the chalk pit at Opham. So they'd actually run a fair amount of distance before they got there. And you can see at the bottom that they refused to walk back, so a carriage was sent for them. So drunkenness was clearly a big problem here. And the thing is, I don't think that women were actually generally more drunk than men. I think they were advertising the fact that they were drunk. Men were just getting drunk quite quietly. If we go all the way back to George Wyatt in 1813, he was just minding his own business, sitting at the bar, drinking his pint when he got arrested. Whereas most of the aggressive stuff and the scraps seemed to be between women. So I think and they were, as you can see, causing a crowd to come round. And they're sort of far more likely to get arrested. But don't take my word for it. I'm going to read. I've got here a quote from an official report from his Inspector of Inebriate Reformatories, R.W. Branthwaite. And this is from his official report in 1909. And I quote, "A drunken woman nearly always becomes hysterical, laughs or dances, or sits on the pavement and screams. She goes for her drinking companion on the slightest provocation, and a policeman has an attraction for her which she cannot possibly resist. A drunken woman quietly wending her way homewards is a sight rarely to be seen." He says of the drunken man, "He usually plods home and struggles with dogged determination, sometimes morose and surly, but more often than not inoffensive if left alone. A semi-drunken man will often make superhuman and successful efforts to get a drunken friend quietly home, but it is a rare occasion to see one woman fulfilling the same office for another." And as you can see from all the evidence, he's quite right. I'm going to leave you with a woman who did very little to dispel that view of the female drunkard, and that's Fanny Trickle. Fanny Trickle was a married woman, and you can't laugh because that's her name, that's not her fault, right? I've researched this. Her maiden name was Fanny Beard, and she married William Trickle. It's absolutely true. She married Willie Trickle, who was a labourer in the town. And anyway, that's we can't laugh at that. That's not fair. Anyway, so yeah, Fanny Trickle was up there. She's outside the Elephant and Castle on Castle Banks, and she was creating a great disturbance, shouting and squealing, and was struggling with the men who were trying to get her home. Witness advised her repeatedly to go home with friends, but she refused, and eventually he took her home himself. I'm assuming he took her to her home and not to his. I imagine Mrs. Upton wouldn't be too pleased if Fanny Trickle arrived on the doorstep. She said a defendant gave her a woman gave her a smack in the mouth, and she returned it. That's what they did. And to top it all, she denied that she was drunk. So it's a full house of all the classic excuses that they use. Thanks.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Matt. Fantastic. I've heard that talk before, and that mention of Fanny Trickle I love it. And the fact that she was Fanny Beard.
Yeah, that was a maiden name. I saw the marriage certificate. I had to see for myself.
Does anybody have any questions for Matt on our kind of? I like the fact that some of those newspaper clippings, you can sort of pick up the Hastings Observer and just changing the words slightly, it sort of still goes on really.
Yeah.
Anybody got any or any drunken confessions that you might make? Anyway, if you haven't, they're all incredibly sober. Yes, there's one question.
Why do you think there was a kind of spike of drunkenness around that time?
Well, there was a
Or
huge.
was it?
Yeah.
Or was it just
No, I think that they actually closed 12 pubs in Lewes in 1907. So 1 in 6 pubs they closed. And the Inebriates Authority, that appeared in 1902 due to the 1898 Inebriates Act. And I just have a feeling there was just a real crackdown because they were able to they were able to justify closing down 12 pubs in one town in 1907. And I just have a feeling that a couple of years before, they thought, right, let's make it really obvious why we're closing this, and just more and more reports of drunkenness. So I've just got a feeling that perhaps there wasn't more drunkenness, they were just arresting people and being far more harsh than they were before. So eventually they could just justify, look, this is getting ridiculous, we need to have these reformatories, we need to close these pubs as well. So I think the catalyst was the 1898 Inebriates Act that just brought it to the fore, really. Yeah.
And the reformatories, when did they go? When did they...
Actually, those there were 14 in the country, all arrived around 1902. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, they'd all closed. Didn't work. They could not reform. Someone could be, you'd either go in for 1, 2 or 3 years. You could be a model inmate for 3 years, obviously not touching a drop, and quite often the moment they were out, they were back on the gin, back on the rum, back on the brown ale. So they realised they weren't reformatories. What they were meant to do didn't work.
Like prohibition in America.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, just took it underground, I suppose. So, yeah.
Do you know they were exclusively for women?
Yeah, well, actually, they weren't meant to be. But after they'd been open for a year or so, they realised that just shy of 80% of the inmates across the country in these reformatories were women. So they decided to move the men back into prison.
Women got arrested more often for being drunk than men. Men just got taken home.
Partly because they were, in those days they were the breadwinners, and secondly it was an alternative to prison, and I think it was a lot easier. It seemed a lot easier to put a man in prison than a woman if you were going to actually put them somewhere. So that obviously far more male prisons. So the reformatories were an alternative really for women who were hitting the bottle too much.
Question, yeah.
I just wondered, did they actually drink that much? Because that woman with the soldier, she only had 3 drinks.
Yeah. Don't know what they were feeding them. Yeah.
None of them seemed bad.
I mean, they can't have drunk like, people do now, like
Yeah.
shots and,
No, that's right. I've got a feeling actually that the reason the men were just drunk and incapable, they were drinking far more than the women.
Yeah.
So they've outdrunk their sort of violent side or their angry side or their jumping about singing side. They just literally drunk so much that they were rolling about, whereas the women didn't have much beer actually. And
it just makes you wonder whether they just acted, like you said, drunk, kind of, because it just seems that they wouldn't have had that much, been in the pub that long for a start.
No, that's right, yeah. There are Lewes is just one example. I use Lewes partly because I lived there, and secondly because it was well known for having so many pubs. Lewes now has 18 pubs, and it's got about 18,000 people, so it's a pub for every 1,000 people. Back until 1907, in the Edwardian period, there was a pub for every 185 people. So it's the equivalent now, for the head of population we've got, of having around 95 pubs in Lewes. So you can imagine wherever you went, whether you went to work, you went to see a friend, you went to church, you're going to pass a lot of pubs on your way. So there was a huge amount. So that's another reason I chose Lewes. The only place the only place in Sussex that outdid Lewes for that was Rye, which had something like a pub for every 90 people. It was huge. It probably still does outdo Lewes.
Yes, question, yeah.
I feel like I know more about Edwardians than I've ever understood before, so thank you for that. I'm just wondering, do you think this is maybe the way in to start looking at history? I think I've found history very dry as a child at school, but it focusing on the people.
Well, that's it. And I started off talking about the books and the talks about these things. People do give talks about Lewes pubs, and I have the utmost respect for them. One of them's a friend of mine, John David, does really good talks on old pubs. But a lot of the history talks I've gone to, being a historian myself, I just think they could, there's so much more interesting stuff as well as looking at just old buildings. There's lives that happen behind those. I suppose partly because I'm a genealogist as well, so I'm always looking at people's lives and families and all that sort of stuff, and skeletons in the closet. That I realise that you're right, it's too dry some of the time. And there are human stories that we can all relate to. even though this happened well over 100 years ago, that we can all relate to, and we can actually think, well, actually, we haven't changed that much as a society. You know, we think, someone was saying earlier that, you know, it all seemed to be prim and proper, the Edwardians, and everything was done just right. Not at all, not half of it. You know, so I'd rather be running around Lewes at midnight nowadays than I would in 1904. Fanny Trickle will be after me, and the Dark Angel or something, you know. But yeah, I'm glad I've made you think that way, because that's really part of the reason I do these talks, is just sort of bring history, a bit of fun to history, but without, but still keeping it very informative. You know, this is proper history. It's just a quirkier side of it.
Well done.
Brilliant. And so if there's no more questions, well, Matt is going to be around, I'm sure, for a few minutes, as is Ben and Fiona. So if you've got questions and you want to ask the speakers, then feel free to come and find them and bombard them. And as I said earlier, if anybody does want to give a talk here or at Printers in Eastbourne, then please come and see me. If you're female, that's even better. And thank you so much. It's open to everyone. So thank you so much for coming tonight. Can I, just before we end, can I just ask everyone to thank the speakers we had, Ben and Fiona, of course, and Matt. So you can just show up. I don't know if you noticed, but well, I hope you did, because Daniel Hewson, who sat at the back very modestly, was playing the piano just before the start. So thank you very much to Dan for doing that, and to Kinetiatra for hosting the Bavard. So thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thanks to Tim for hosting it all.
Yeah.